In 1984, Frank Davies was renowned among his classmates for his resourcefulness. He was among the top performers in science subjects, but was among the last in other subjects. However, Frank Davies stood out from his peers for the beauty of his calligraphy. He was a calligrapher in the eyes of his peers. His talent for calligraphy earned him the favor of the teachers and the administration. Teachers and the school administration used his services when they needed to write banners for activities or underline tables on the notice board. His unsupervised access to the teachers' lounge and administration offices enabled him to harness his cleverness to gain access to the scorebooks. He was able to edit them without attracting attention, which is why he was able to make it to his final year. At the age of 22, he applied for the police inspector's exam. He was successful and enrolled at the Police Institute, where he received training. Frank Davies demonstrated an aptitude for learning that was recognized by his teachers at the police academy, and he was able to rank in the top of his class. As a result, he was assigned to his hometown of Chicago. He was given the task of receiving citizens. Within a few months of joining the department, his colleagues noticed his suspicious behavior towards a number of expatriates, which became the subject of whispered conversations in the department's offices. Frank used his cunning to defraud citizens. He carefully selected his victims, most of whom were simple people. After the citizen presents him with his documents, he pretends to examine the documents and in the blink of an eye hides the postage stamp, telling the citizen in front of him that the file is incomplete, lacks a postage stamp, and he has to complete the file. When the citizen goes to buy the postage stamp, he calls him, pretending to want to help him. He takes the postage stamp out of the desk drawer and says, "I have this postage stamp, pay for it and save yourself the trouble of going to buy it from abroad." This is how he would sell the stolen postage stamp to the person he stole it from. When his boss learned about what was going on in the reception department and what Frank was doing, it was decided to transfer him to the prison. He did not resent his work, even though many of his colleagues hated working in prison. What's more, Frank was strangely passionate about his new job. 3 years later, out of the blue, Frank resigned from his job. The man seemed ready to move on to a new phase in his life. In his 3 years in prison, he had learnt that robbery offenders usually received light sentences, so he frequently called them into his office, deliberately provoking them so that they would not forget him. When he left work in the evening, he would head to the public squares. He was not interested in the spectacle of the public space or the food on offer there, but he would stalk the thieves he had met in prison, and when he caught one of them after he had snatched a wallet from a passerby, he would follow him, take half the money in the wallet and any papers that might be in it, and let the thief go free. He did this most days of the week. He managed to accumulate a decent amount of money, but he felt that more important than money were the national identity cards he was able to keep. There were about 20 ID cards, which he carefully selected with the main condition that the owner had to be close to him in age. Now that he had quit his job, Frank decided to move on to the next stage. He started with a national identity card belonging to a man named Benjamin Martin. This man was from San Antonio. His wallet was stolen while he was walking around. Frank replaced the cardholder's photo with his own. Mastering the forgery? It was his first step on the road to crime. He traveled to the city of San Antonio, where the national ID holder was from, entered a banking agency, opened an account in the name of Benjamin Martin, and asked for the checkbook, which the bank employee promised to provide a few days later. He returned and received the checkbook. Frank then went to a jewelry store, bought a gold necklace, and paid with the checkbook. He was traveling under the name Benjamin Martin before it was evening. He was on his way to Houston. There he was able to sell what he had bought in San Antonio and return to Chicago. The operation seemed profitable, so he repeated the same scenario in other cities. In Houston, he found an outlet for his belongings, which he paid for with checks in the names of people whose national identity cards had been stolen. His income from these operations increased, and he opened a bank account in his real name. He deposited the money he made from the scams. Frank Davies realized that it was an easy, low-effort, money-making scheme. Since greed knows no bounds, he decided to take his activity to a higher level, targeting the most prestigious and expensive jewelry stores. He had a different way of dealing with the owners of fine jewelry shops. He believed that being condescending to the owners would make them fall into his traps quickly. He went to Atlanta. In one of the city's poorest hotels, he rented an entire suite and used the identification card of a prominent businessman from Phoenix. He had used it before to open a bank account to get a checkbook. His plan was not to be the customer. He would pretend to be an escort for a wealthy Arab who wanted to buy high-value jewelry. When the shop owner shows him his jewelry, he selects the most beautiful and valuable pieces, then asks him to bring them to the hotel at 4 p.m. to show them directly to the Arab dignitary. Frank would offer him a real check to cover the cost of traveling to the hotel. Known for his shrewdness, he was sure that the man would cash the check to make sure the customer was wealthy and able to pay, and so he would sign his victims. When the jeweler arrives at the hotel, Frank greets him in the salon of the suite where the wealthy Arab man is supposed to be. He asks his victim to keep his voice down so as not to disturb the wealthy man. He takes the jewelry from him, then enters the bedroom, pretending to show it to the wealthy Arab. After a while, he comes out. He chooses the most expensive jewelry, deliberately leaving some of them so as not to arouse suspicion. After determining the price, Frank enters the bedroom to get the check containing the agreed amount. When he returns, he engages his victim in a maze of conversations designed to ensure that the merchant only leaves the hotel suite after the banking agencies have closed their doors, and immediately after the merchant leaves, Frank goes down to the front desk, pays the hotel dues, and then quickly disappears. It was an operation that saved him more money than he could have imagined. He had been involved in the construction of a hotel in Chicago, so we see him doing the same with fine jewelry stores in several cities. In Chicago, he drove luxury cars and lived a lavish lifestyle. When he met his old colleagues, he would claim that he was engaged in a business that was generating significant profits. He went to Washington, D.C., intending to make a final move. As usual, he checked into one of the city's poorest hotels. He repeated the scenario he had used in the past and managed to trap one of the biggest jewelers in Washington. As soon as he completed the transaction, he gathered his bag and went down to the front desk to pay the bill for his stay. As he reached the lift door, he came across a beautiful girl. She was a petite woman in her 20s. When the lift door opened, he let her in first, insisting on appearing like a gentleman. Together they proceeded to the reception desk, him to pay his bill and her to deposit her room key. As they descended, they had exchanged a few words. He learnt that she was from Chicago, and she learnt that he was a businessman from the same city. He left her a card with his phone number, and they promised to meet. 2 days later, the girl seemed very interested, and he was back in Chicago. The girl called him, and they met at the most famous hotel in the city. They met in the hotel's salon. She said she was from an old and wealthy family, currently living in Houston, but constantly coming to Chicago to look after the family's business and real estate interests. He said he worked in real estate and told her about the hotel project. In Atlanta, Houston, and all the cities Frank passed through, the security services had received several complaints from jewelers who were his victims and were investigating. He left a trail of financial devastation behind him, leaving his victims with bad checks. The security services had collected a description of the complainant. After a long session in the hotel salon with the beautiful young woman he had met for the first time in Washington, Frank saw the opportunity to seize some of the girl's possessions and saw marriage as a gateway to a wealthy family. They met several times, and each time he brought her a gift. Each time she demanded more and more expensive if he wanted to get closer to her old and wealthy family. He spent a lot of money. One day, the girl disappeared and her phone was no longer answering. Frank was oblivious, but the security services found him. Frank Davies was arrested one evening, and when he was questioned, he told all the details. When he got to his story about the girl from the wealthy family, the police officer asked him if she was behind him. He turned around. It was her. The officer told him, "You were scammed, so she scammed you." The girl was not the daughter of a wealthy family, but like him, she was shrewd with her beauty, so she chose the path of fraud and deception, and Frank Davies, who thought he was Ducky, was not spared from her cunning.